Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So, continuing the readings on contentment, and I'm approaching them from sort of indirectly. It can be a struggle to work with our cravings and clinging attachment, and so sort of approaching it some, in a way, motivational material for working with our craving, trying to not follow our unskillful cravings. And these are actually some of the Buddhist similes about, start with the Majjhima Nikaya, number 54, excerpt from Potaliya. And this is the Tana Ajahn Thanisaro translation. And just in this preface, in his preface, he writes, in this passage, the Buddha teaches Potaliya, the householder, what it means in the discipline of a noble one to have entirely cut off one's worldly affairs. And there's this refrain that appears again and again in this sutta, which is a bit cryptic, but the footnote says, there's this refrain which includes the line, equanimity based on multiplicity. And that's the equanimity, according to the footnote, equanimity with regards to forms, sounds, smells, taste, and tactile sensations. And according to Ajahn Geoff, in this sutta, the equanimity based on singleness is probably the fourth jhana. Although I also mentioned that various teachers point out that, you don't have to wait until the, jhanas to have a sense of well-being in your practice. And I would guess everyone here has at least a little well-being in their practice. Okay, I'll begin. Suppose a dog overcome with weakness and hunger were to come across a slaughterhouse, and there a dexterous butcher or butcher's apprentice were to fling him a chain of bones, thoroughly scraped, without any flesh, smeared with blood. What do you think? Would the dog gnawing on that chain of bones, thoroughly scraped, without any flesh, smeared with blood, appease its weakness and hunger? No, Lord. And why is that? Because the chain of bones is thoroughly scraped, without any flesh, and smeared with blood. The dog would get nothing but share of weariness and vexation. In the same way, householder, a disciple of the noble ones considers this point. The Blessed One has compared sensuality to a chain of bones, of much stress, much despair, and greater drawbacks. Seeing this with right discernment, as it has come to be, then avoiding the equanimity coming from multiplicity, dependent on multiplicity, he develops the equanimity coming from singleness, dependent on singleness, where sustenance, clinging for the baits of the world ceases without trace. And I'll just read one more analogy. Now suppose that not far from a village or town, there were a dense forest grove, and in the grove was a tree with delicious fruit, abundant fruit, but with no fruit fallen to the ground. A man would come along, desiring fruit, looking for fruit, searching for fruit. Plunging into the forest grove, he would see the tree, and the thought would occur to him, this is a tree with delicious fruit, abundant fruit, and there is no fruit fallen to the ground. But I know how to climb a tree. Why don't I climb the tree, eat what I like, and fill my clothes with fruit? So having climbed the tree, he would eat what he liked and fill his clothes with the fruit. Then a second man would come along, desiring fruit, looking for fruit, searching for fruit, and carrying a sharp axe. Plunging into the forest grove, he would see the tree, and the thought would occur to him, "This is a tree with delicious fruit, abundant fruit, and there is no fruit fallen to the ground, and I don't know how to climb a tree. Why don't I chop down this tree at the root, eat what I like, and fill my clothes with the fruit?" So he would chop the tree at the root. What do you think? If the first man who climbed the tree did not quickly come down, would not the falling tree crush his hand or foot or some other part of his body so that he would meet with death from that cause or with death-like pain? Yes, Lord. In the same way, householder, a disciple of the Noble Ones considers this point. The Blessed One has compared sensuality to the fruits of a tree of much stress, much despair, and greater drawbacks. Seeing this with right discernment as it has come to be, then avoiding the equanimity coming from multiplicity, dependent on multiplicity, he develops the equanimity coming from singleness, dependent on singleness, where sustenance, clinging for the baits of the world, ceases without trace. Okay, and now I'll proceed to some more motivation for helping us to let go. And this is just considering what the suttas say about, and the various canon and such say about rebirth. And yeah, I find this interesting, and this is various teachers in this tradition, they'll associate the different realms, like mental states, with different realms, and oftentimes they'll compare when we're caught in really intense craving to the realm of the hungry ghost. So I'll just read a brief excerpt from the Buddhist Cosmos by Ajahn Punnadhammo. Page 290. Individual petas vary greatly in form, but some characteristics may be regarded as normal for this class of being, as they recur again and again in the descriptions. The typical peta is naked, ugly, and stinking. He is emaciated by his long hunger, lean with prominent ribs and veins. This is a quote from the Udana commentary. They are hungry and thirsty, living off the gifts of others, very miserable, deprived of happiness. And then a quote from the Petawatu. Some are clothed in rags, others covered only by their hair. The Petas wander in search of food, going this way and that. Having roamed far and finding nothing, overcome by hunger, they stagger and fall, swooning to the earth. And now I'll read an excerpt from the Sangha Nikaya, which is a massive collection of teachings to connect. And at the very, very end of this collection, so in this book it's page 1885, there's this teaching on rebirth which caught my attention years ago, and that was quite striking for consideration, contemplation. In the Satya Samyutta, this is number 104. Then the Blessed One took up a little bit of soil in his fingernail and addressed the bhikkhus thus. What do you think, bhikkhus? Which is more, the little bit of soil in my fingernail or the great earth? Venerable Sir, the great earth is more. The little bit of soil that the Blessed One has taken up in his fingernail is trifling, compared to the great earth, the little bit of soil that the Blessed One has taken up in his fingernail, is not calculable, does not bear comparison, does not amount even to a fraction. So too, bhikkhus, those beings are few whom when they pass away as human beings are reborn among human beings, but those beings are more numerous who when they pass away as human beings are reborn in the domain of the ghost. For what reason? Because, bhikkhus, they have not seen the Four Noble Truths. What for? The Noble Truth of suffering, the Noble Truth of the origin of suffering, the Noble Truth of the cessation of suffering, the Noble Truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Therefore, bhikkhus, an exertion should be made to understand this is suffering. An exertion should be made to understand this is the cause of suffering. An exertion should be made to understand this is the cessation of suffering. An exertion should be made to understand this is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Okay. And now this will be a last substantial reading. This is a reading from Meditations 8, compilation of Dhamma talks by Ajahn Punnadhammo. And this Dhamma talk is on September 17th, 2016, and it's called Chickens from Hell. And I'll be reading the beginning and the end and skipping over the middle. We like to feed on our thoughts, which is why we feed them. We gain entertainment from them. We gain help with our occupation in life, especially if we're employed in a job that rewards thinking. So to keep the thoughts going, we just keep feeding them. But as the Buddha noted, our thoughts then turn around and feed on us. In his words, they actually chew on us. We think we're getting the better part of the deal. We feed them, they give us nourishment of one kind or another. We tend not to notice how much they're eating away at us, and that we're actually getting the worst part of the deal. We notice that we're being eaten away, but we don't make the connection as to what's eating away at us. Often the thoughts that we feed on cause us a lot of trouble. If we're not discerning, we just gobble down everything that the mind churns up, identifying it as my thought and thinking that I've got to make something with it. Sometimes we get totally chewed up by our thoughts, and yet then we turn around and keep feeding them some more. Just a brief note, I'm going to edit out a bit of the profanity, just to tone it down a little. Just a one-word substitution. It's as if we had some chickens. We feed them so that they give us eggs, but it turns out they don't produce only eggs. They also produce chicken poop, and we don't know which is which. So we just gobble down everything that comes out of the chickens, and of course we get sick. At the same time, it turns out that they're the chickens from hell. They come and peck at us when we're not aware of it, like the birds in the Hitchcock film. The problem is that we don't make the connection. The chickens pecking at us are the ones we're feeding, so we keep on feeding them. One of the purposes of getting the mind into concentration is to step back from the whole process and learn to see it as it's happening. At the same time, we practice concentration to give the mind an alternative place to feed. Otherwise, we'll just keep feeding on whatever the chickens produce. When the Buddha provides analogies for different parts of the path, concentration is almost always the food. The first jhana is grass and water, the fourth jhana is ghee and honey, and lots of other good things. We need this kind of food because if the mind does not have something good to feed on, it's going to feed on whatever it can get. As the Buddha said, if you don't have a pleasure that's apart from sensuality, then no matter how much you understand the drawbacks of sensuality, you're going to go back and nibble on sensuality in secret. So try to develop a sense of ease and well-being with the breath as an alternative source of food. We talked today about rapture. That's actually the food of the concentration when you're really hungry. The pleasure is the kind of food for when you're not quite so hungry, and equanimity is the feeling you have when everything is satisfied. The different parts of the body that have been lacking energy now have their energy supplied, so you don't have to keep gobbling things down. So try to tune into a sense of well-being. Notice how you breathe and which parts of the body are especially sensitive to the breathing process. When you breathe in, what's the part that gets satisfied? What are the parts that you're trying to satisfy as you breathe in? If you begin to notice that, then you can provide yourself with a sense of well-being very easily. Just go straight to those parts, and then, when they're satisfied, try to notice the parts that are not so obvious, but could use a dose of pleasure as well. It's as if you're sending food to different parts of the body. First, you feed the ones that are clamoring the most. Then you try to spread the nourishment around to the quieter parts. Okay, so I'll skip ahead to the end. Geoff talks about dealing with thoughts and emotions, but I'm going to skip to the end. But all this requires that you have an alternative source of food. Feed off the directed thought and evaluation. Get interested in the issues of the breath. How do you make the breath energy really good? And what is the breath energy, anyhow? How do you sense when it's flowing well and when it's not flowing well? What ways of dealing with the breath improve your health? What ways wear you down? These are things that you can study, that are worth studying, because the breath can be medicine for the diseases of the body and the mind. It can help bring a balance to a body that's out of balance, or to a mind that's out of balance, because it's good, nourishing food, a lot better than the chicken poop that we've been feeding off for so long. So meditation is a matter of learning new feeding habits that will be really good for you. And as for the chickens, you can let them starve. It's not that you won't be thinking anymore, but you realize that you've been feeding way too many chickens. At the same time, you get more and more discerning about which chickens are the ones that are actually feeding on you. Those you can stop feeding. And at the same time, you also get more discerning about what's the chicken poop and what are the chicken eggs, so that when you have to think, you're eating only eggs. As you get really good at the meditation, you don't have to eat those either. They're still there. Awakening doesn't mean that you don't think anymore, but you find that you can do a lot of things with the eggs besides just eating them. You can fix food for other people. Meanwhile, you've got the food of your concentration. You've got the food that comes from getting the mind to settle down with a sense of well-being. Feeding all the parts of the body that need breath energy each time you breathe in, and learning how to let that sense of being nourish, spread out so that it seems to fill every cell in the body. That pulls you out of the vicious cycle of feeding the chickens and then having them to come back to peck your eyes out at night. Ultimately, as the Buddha said, there comes a point where the mind doesn't have to feed anymore at all. The well-being of awakening, the well-being of release, is totally free from any need to depend on conditions. It's described as a state that's free from hunger, not because you've told yourself not to be hungry, but because you've fully satisfied the mind. So that's where we're aiming, and we start by learning new feeding habits. They'll get you on the healthy path. And so I have a tiny reading to end on a positive note. just from the beginning of the island. Quote from the Sutta Nipata. Sutta Nipata 1094. Having nothing, clinging to nothing, that is the island. There is no other. That is Nibbana, I tell you, the total ending of aging and death.
I thought it was quite nice the way that you're reading there Ajahn Geoff towards the end. He mentioned it, I think, in a couple different ways. It actually connected to the very first bit that you read from the suttas in terms of the equanimity of diverse. I think Bhikkhu Bodhi says that of diversification, meaning the equanimity related to the six sense bases, is the basis for the equanimity that one finds during meditation. It is the equanimity of unification. And that really, it's like, for me, points to this really important aspect where one's attitude towards the sensory world throughout the sort of workaday world or sort of the normal day provides the foundation for the sort of more profound the equanimity of the contentment or being satisfied during meditation. It's like if you're sort of running around chasing your senses all day long and then you sit down and meditate, trying to shift gears, it's going to be brutal. But if you're sort of kind of cultivating that sense of space or that sense of centeredness throughout the day, it'd probably be easier when one sits down and meditate.
Chickens. Talking about chickens. This has nothing to do with Dhamma, actually, but I heard recently that the chicken, well, it might have something to do with it, is that the chicken is actually, they're making discoveries now that dinosaurs didn't become extinct, they actually became birds and evolved into birds, and chicken is actually Tyrannosaurus Rex. became a chicken, actually. There's one theory. That they actually found that it sort of devolved possibly into the modern day chicken.
Dinosaur poop that were.
So in terms of vicious, chickens being vicious and pecking your eyes out.
On that note.